So what are all these terms here? These are the terms that you need to familiarize yourself with. You have tripomastigotes, amastigotes, promastigotes, epimastigotes, procyclic, tripomastigotes. You'll be hearing a lot of these terms. Now, blood and tissue protozoans, as far as the content is concerned, belongs to the phylum Mastigophora, meaning whip-bearing, from the Greek mastigophoros. Now, all these terms pertain to different life stages of your blood and tissue protozoans. Some might be present on some species, while some may be absent. Now, those are the things that you will learn in this lecture. The tripomastigotes, in general, resides in the lower GI tract, particularly of the vector. Amastigotes, with the prefix A, meaning it has no mastigote, it has no whip. And these are usually seen within or inside cells or tissues. And your epimastigotes, on the other hand, resides in the upper GI tract of the insect vector. Nasa epin, upper GI tract. Now, blood and tissue flagellates are considered part of the WHO list of neglected tropical diseases. So they are here: Leishmaniasis, Chagas disease, and sleeping sickness. Now, locally acquired infections due to the blood and tissue flagellates have not been diagnosed here in the Philippines. However, because of fast and easy travel, as well as increase in human migration, this girl over here, she's the one at fault. This girl. Imported cases from endemic countries may become the source of future infection in the Philippines. Now, this consequence is most valid because the vectors of the blood and tissue flagellates that we will be discussing are found in the country. While the infections themselves are not endemic in the country, the vectors that carry the disease is endemic in the Philippines. Our first topic would be Leishmania. Okay, so if you take a look down, you have notes there, and I'm going to update the notes there as often as I can to focus on the keywords that you have to study as far as the main topics are concerned. Leishmaniasis is primarily a disease of poverty, and its victims are among the poorest. The actual true burden of Leishmaniasis remains largely invisible, as those most affected are in remote areas and patients are kept hidden by particularly social stigma, which is associated with the deformities generated by the disease. The disease is also linked to deforestation, to building of dams and irrigation, and actually the consequences of rapid urbanization. And these are from the World Health Organization Tropical Disease Report. Leishmania parasites are named after Dr. Leishman, who knew, and it affects primarily 12 million people. Now, the statistics are rather improving. The stats for Leishmaniasis has been improving over the past years. Currently, around 2016, more than 1 billion people are still at risk. 1.3 million from 2010's value of 2 million over here. So there is a slight decrease in the annual cases. And 400,000 cases of visceral leishmaniasis were documented. And there were also 900,000 cases of cutaneous leishmaniasis. You will learn about the different types of leishmaniasis as we go along the lecture. And 30,000 people still die annually as of 2016. That is actually compared to 52,000 back in 2010. The demographic distribution of leishmaniasis are as follows. Okay? As you can see, you have a lot of South American countries such as Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Central America, Peru. You have Brazil also here. You also have a lot of Asian countries: Iran, Syria, these are Middle East countries, Afghanistan. You have Bangladesh, Ethiopia, this is an African nation. You have India. Basically, it is distributed in a lot of areas. It is endemic in a lot of areas in the world. The causative agent for Leishmaniasis is an obligate intracellular protozoan of the genus Leishmania. Now, there are a lot more than 20 species of Leishmania, and the most common ones are your Donovani, Major, and Brasiliense. Now, more species are still emerging, especially in association with HIV/AIDS. Now, we will be discussing a little bit of that later on. As you can see, this is a photomicrograph of Leishmania in a blood film using Romanovsky's snake. Leishmaniasis is transmitted mainly by bites from sandflies of the genus Phlebotomus and Notzomia. Now, the primary reservoir hosts for the disease are dogs and even humans. The vector looks like a mosquito, but it is a sandfly. Please take note the size of the sandfly. It is half or even a third the size of a mosquito, so it's really very small. A lot of people would mistake it for a small mosquito. Aside from being transmitted via the bites of sandflies, it can also be transmitted via the following. You have your blood transfusion, wound contamination, exposure to contaminated samples, and even through vertical transmission or transplacental transfer. Take note that Leishmaniasis is a blood-borne infection. This is the life cycle of Leishmania. Now, where do we start? We start with the introduction of the Leishmanial parasite. Your promastigotes, which are flagellated, this one over here, enter the human bloodstream through the bite of your insect vector. Let's try to highlight those things. So this is your promastigote, which is flagellated, and it enters via the bite of your sandfly, and it enters the human bloodstream. It is ingested by macrophages. Please take note. Promastigotes are considered the infective stage. They then the promastigotes transform into amastigotes inside your macrophages, and they reproduce there through binary fission. The macrophages then burst once they have a lot of your amastigotes inside, then they release the daughter amastigotes in this stage here. The daughter amastigotes, which are released from ruptured macrophages, would proceed to infect other macrophages. Now, infected macrophages are ingested by the sandfly in this stage as it bites an infected individual. And inside the lower intestinal tract, in the midgut, the amastigotes would undergo several stages of differentiation and also would migrate from the midgut to the foregut, or in the proboscis of the sandfly, from an amastigote going back into its promastigote stage. So therefore, you end up with another promastigote inside the biting mouth part of your sandfly, which is the proboscis. Now, there are several forms of Leishmaniasis. Now, the main ones would be, as we mentioned earlier, Cutaneous Leishmaniasis, which is abbreviated CL. You also have Mucocutaneous Leishmaniasis, or MCL, Diffuse Cutaneous Leishmaniasis, which is DCL, and you have your Visceral Leishmaniasis, or VL. The bigger the font, the more important it is, clinically, epidemiologically. Now let's discuss the symptoms of Leishmaniasis, and we start first with Cutaneous Leishmaniasis. CL is also considered or called Baghdad ulcer, Delhi boil, or Bouton d'Orient. I really don't know how to pronounce that. And it is the most common form. Please take note, CL is the most common form of Leishmaniasis, and it is caused by three major species: your Leishmania major, Leishmania tropica, and Leishmania infantum. And it is usually seen in the Africas or in parts of Asia. Now, the symptoms are raised edges with a central crater, and they can be up to around 200 painless, simple skin lesions. Remember that the primary lesion of Leishmania is primarily painless. Now, wounds heal from the center within a few months. They heal from the inside out. However, they cause unsightly scarring. As you can see here, this is an example of a cutaneous leishmaniasis wherein it actually eats up part of the ear. Now, these are examples. Let's try to remove the inks. Okay, so these are the bite sites of your sandfly, causing unsightly scarring. And in some cases, these are permanent scars. Now, the lesions caused by your cutaneous leishmaniasis is often characterized as a volcano sign because you have raised edges with a central crater. As you can see, you have a volcano sign, a raised edge with a deep cratering in the middle. Now, this is a volcano. This is Mount Pinatubo, for those of you who don't know. Now, the second form of leishmaniasis is mucocutaneous leishmaniasis, or MCL. Now, the symptoms, let's start with the causative agent, primarily of the species Leishmania brasiliensis. Now, the symptoms are, in contrast to your Baghdad ulcer, these are called your Chiclero ulcers. And the reason why it is called mucocutaneous leishmaniasis is because of its site of predilection, which is usually in the mucocutaneous areas of the body, such as the mouth and the nose. So as you can see, this man's nose is actually eroded because of mucocutaneous leishmaniasis. Now, this particular lesion is also called spondia, from the, I'm guessing Latin, spongia, which is sponge-like. So the mucocutaneous areas, regions of the body, particularly of the face, becomes sponge-like because of the lesion. This is also called Breda's disease, at least in some literature. And as you can see here, in severe cases, it involves the nose as well as the mouth. The next form of leishmaniasis is diffuse cutaneous leishmaniasis, or DCL, and it is caused by Leishmania ethiopica and Leishmania mexicana. Now, from the name itself, it is disseminated, and this is a chronic compilation of skin lesions, and it resembles lepromatous leprosy. Here are pictures. As you can see, it disseminated in the entire face and even the rest of the body. Now, the last type of leishmaniasis is called visceral leishmaniasis, VL, or Kala-azar. It is caused by Leishmania donovani and in some cases, Leishmania chagasi. Now, the symptoms of Kala-azar is very much different from the different types of Leishmania we've been talking about. Now, from the name itself, it is visceral in nature. As you can see, it affects not particularly the integumentary tissues, but the gastrointestinal tissues, particularly the liver and the spleen. As you can see, this child over here has massive hepatomegaly and splenomegaly. This child also over here has massive hepatomegaly and massive splenomegaly. The symptoms associated with VL are as follows. So you have fever. Initially, you'd have fever. And what is double quotidian? There are 2 spikes of fever per day. That's double quotidian. Now, the hepatomegaly, or the liver pathology part happens early in the disease, and it is due to hepatic resistance. Now, the liver is trying to resist the parasitic infection. Then there is granuloma formation. You have activation of liver natural killer cells. However, there is a defective oxidative pathway of the Kupffer cells, and you have tumor necrosis factor mediated protection. So that is the main immunologic protection mechanism going on as the liver tries to protect itself from the infection, causing your hepatomegaly. Now, splenomegaly, on the other hand, this usually occurs later in the disease, and it is due to splenic destruction. You have sequestration of infected lymphocytes, especially in the marginal zone of the spleen. You have tumor necrosis factor mediated destruction of the splenic architecture. You also have monocytosis, which leads to pancytopenia, which leads to immunodeficiency. Please take note of that. The monocytosis, which is due to the chronic inflammation, leads to pancytopenia eventually, which pancytopenia is a form of immunodeficiency. Now, Once you get immunodeficiency, you have superimposed bacterial infection, you have pneumonia, you have dysentery, you have TB, and the mortality reaches 100%. I kid you not, 100%. Monocytosis also increases the number of macrophage present in the system. Now, we mentioned earlier during the life cycle that Leishmania hitches a ride with macrophages, right? Therefore, monocytosis increases the number of macrophages. Therefore, you have more vectors for the amastigotes to infect, further aggravating the circumstance. Now, just a trivia, Kala-azar here is Hindi for black illness. Kala-azar, black illness, 100% mortality. In Filipino, it's Kaka-azar. Sorry. Now, the next type of Leishmaniasis is your Post-kala-azar dermal Leishmaniasis, or PKDL. This is a special form, which is just a sequelae of your Kala-azar. So after you develop your visceral Leishmaniasis, you then develop hypopigmented maculopapular, or nodular rashes without any other systemic symptoms. And while while PKDL is not necessarily life-threatening, it's primarily a skin lesion, it still contributes to disease transmission, and people with PKDL can still transmit the disease. Here is an example of a PKDL. Now, we need to discuss the pathogenesis of Leishmaniasis. And in the discussion, it is primarily a spectrum and a paradigm of Leishmania infection. At the oligoparasitic end, this end here, there is Leishmania recidivans, LR, a hyperurgic variant of cutaneous leishmaniasis. Chronic lesions in this stage slowly expand while healing at the center. This is the cutaneous leishmaniasis we've been discussing earlier. Amastigotes are sparse and mononuclear cell infiltrates predominate. There is predominance of cell-mediated immunity managed by interleukin-2 and interferon gamma from Th1 and natural killer cells. Now, IL-12 mediates Th1 differentiation, and all these processes confer some sort of resistance to the parasite. Reactive oxygen species are also active, and there is granuloma formation seen particularly in the liver cell, as we've discussed earlier. Now, this is somewhat analogous to tuberculoid leprosy, in which there is an intense mononuclear infiltrate with few mycobacteria. Now, this side of the spectrum, the left side of the spectrum, is considered the better side of the disease spectrum. Meaning, if you have Leishmaniasis, you'd want to have it on this particular area of the spectrum. Now, the other side of the spectrum, on the other hand, is the polyparasitic end. DCL will be part of this end of the spectrum. While this is a relatively uncommon disease of the spectrum, there is evidence of little effective cell-mediated immune response here. Now, heavily parasitized macrophages are abundant throughout the dermis, and few lymphocytes are present. Now, peripheral blood mononuclear cells neither proliferate nor produce interferon gamma or IL-2. So there is absence of IL-2 and interferon gamma in this end of the spectrum. And cutaneous delayed type hypersensitivity reactions are absent in this case. So there is no granuloma formation or minimal granuloma formation. There is also Th1 macrophage inactivation, and there is a preponderance for Th2 rather than your Th1 macrophage. And this results to more susceptibility to further infection. In short, the immune response is generally absent or blunted when you look at diseases in this end of the spectrum. Now, DCL has been compared to lepromatous leprosy, in which there is large number of mycobacteria in macrophages, and there is no or little evidence of protective Th1 cell-mediated immune responses. In general, when studying the pathogenesis of Leishmania, You have to take a look at it as a spectrum rather than as individual types of Leishmania infection. In cases wherein you have blunted immunity, you have a polyparasitic event. Well, if you have good enough immunity, you have your oligoparasitic events. Your oligoparasitic end of the spectrum includes your cutaneous leishmaniasis, while your polyparasitic involves your diffuse cutaneous leishmaniasis or even your visceral leishmaniasis. Diagnosing leishmaniasis involves several different diagnostic tools. Now you can opt for direct visualization. However, this is unsuitable for use in the field setting. So what do? You get a tissue aspirate from spleen, bone marrow, or lymph nodes, and being invasive, it is not suitable in field settings. Now, direct visualization of actual parasites would be still the gold standard. If you see a mastigote there, or a trypomastigote there, or promastigotes in blood or tissue samples, then you will be 100% sure that you're dealing with leishmaniasis. Okay, so here are promastigotes and here are amastigotes. Here are actually macrophages, and each of those black dots there would be your amastigotes. You can also do freeze-dried direct agglutination test, or DAT, and this one detects antibodies. There. You put a drop of blood, if it coagulates, then you are positive for a Leishmania infection. Now, your Leishmanin or Montenegro skin test is a skin test used to detect exposure, much like what you do in PPD. You remember your PPD test, skin test? So it's similar to that. It's used to detect exposure, primarily used for cutaneous and mucocutaneous leishmaniasis. However, take note, the skin test cannot be used against visceral leishmaniasis. And why? Because going back to the pathophysiology, in the pathophysio of VL, you have an anergic immune system, meaning your immune system is really, really blunted. Therefore, since Leishmanin skin test utilizes your immune reaction to the antigen, if you are anergic, then you won't be able to elicit an immune response to create a positive skin test. This is a skin test. This is a positive result, very similar to PPD. Now, most cases of cutaneous leishmaniasis heal without treatment. In many parts of South and Southwest Asia, infections were deliberately encouraged on the butts of babies in order to immunize them. Okay, this is called leishmanization. Intentional inoculation of Leishmania produces a partial immunity. Therefore, to avoid the polyparasitic end of the disease spectrum, visceral leishmaniasis, diffuse cutaneous leishmaniasis, they would opt to have cutaneous leishmaniasis early on in life so that they would develop immunity. Other forms of leishmaniasis require long courses, and if you need to give anti-leishmaniasis drugs, you use pentavalent antimony drugs, particularly meglumine antimonate and sodium stibogluconate. These are primarily antimony-containing drugs. There have been a lot of reports of resistance against antimony-containing drugs, and they're experimenting right now with liposomal amphotericin B. The brand name, I think, is called Ambisome. We know that amphotericin B is being used as an antifungal agent. A limited stock of this particular drug here is kept at the World Health Organization headquarters to allow a rapid response in case of leishmaniasis outbreaks and to cover for unseen circumstances in affected countries. Now, the prices of amphotericin B and meglumine drastically reduced due to the cooperation of both the international health organizations as well as multinational companies. As far as visceral leishmaniasis is concerned, miltefosine is the first oral treatment for Kala-azar. It is still the first oral treatment, first line oral treatment. As far as cutaneous leishmaniasis is concerned, paramomycin, which is an aminoglycoside, can also be used topically for CL and can be used as oral second-line treatment for visceral leishmaniasis. Now, an injectable formula is being developed in some countries. It is usually given for antimony-resistant Leishmania donovani strains. It is safer and cheaper than amphotericin B. Still under development though. How do you prevent and control Leishmaniasis? Now, knowing the life cycle, knowing the pathogenesis, vector control still remains one of the most important prevention strategies. Insect repellents, insecticides, insecticide-treated bed nets, or ITNs, can be given to populations of endemic areas. Now, they've been also experimenting regarding reservoir control. They give poison baits to try to limit the number of reservoirs. And of course, case detection, management, and surveillance is very important. Okay, now we have to take note that vector and reservoir host control measures are quite expensive and it requires good infrastructure and maintenance. And results are often short-lived. So what now? Several mechanisms by which Leishmania and HIV may interact and affect the immune system to influence the expression of one another has been emphasized. We mentioned earlier that Leishmania is closely associated with HIV/AIDS. It is now considered an opportunistic AIDS infection. How does Leishmania and HIV live side by side? Possible effects of Leishmania that favor HIV replication appear to be transactivation of HIV in latently infected monocytes, and in both antigen-specific manner and antigen non-specific manner, primarily in infected CD4 T cells. Now, other evidence would indicate polyclonal B cell activation, enhancement of the activity of Th2 cells, decreased HIV-specific CD8 cytotoxic T cell response, and even the depression of activity of Th1 cells. Now, we discussed earlier, T helper 1 cells is required for a more oligoparasitic or a more benign manifestation, while Th2 or T helper 2 cells are more associated with the polyparasitic end of the disease spectrum. Possible effects of HIV that favor amastigote multiplication are the deactivation of macrophage function, depression of activity of Th1 cells, inhibition of phagosome lysozyme fusion, and even the enhancement of some Th2 functions. Again, Leishmania, HIV, they go hand in hand. HIV/AIDS predisposes to visceral leishmaniasis, while visceral leishmaniasis accelerates HIV progression. Now, this dual infection is usually seen in European countries, and this is primarily due to IV drug use. So that's it for leishmaniasis. Thank you for watching.